Okay, welcome everybody. I think it's time to get started. We have a full room, which is great, especially for CMMN as a new topic. Welcome to this webinar. First, maybe a quick organizational issue. If you have, I already wrote that in the chat. If you have any problems with the audio, what often helps us to dial in via landline using a phone. So if you experience any problem, that would be a good thing to do. We will send an email afterwards with a link to the recording. So the recording will be online afterwards. All the code which I have in the demo will be online afterwards, and the slides will be available via SlideShare. So you will get everything afterwards easily. Okay. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so we don't have a separate moderation today. So the Q&A session is at the end. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the chat window. So that's your channel to communicate with me. I will do, basically I will answer them in one block at the end. Okay. So I will not answer all the questions between the webinar, because that gets a bit hard for me to do here. Yeah, my name is Bernd Rücker. I'm one of the two founders of Camunda. Myself, I have a lot of experience with workflow for more than 10 years now, and I am basically a Java EE developer. That's my personal background. I worked with a lot of different open source workflow engines in the past, and yeah, basically what I do today is a mixture of being an evangelist, doing the webinars, doing a lot of presentations and talks, conferences, or writing articles and these kind of things. But I'm also head of consulting at Camunda, and I'm still doing consulting assignments, especially proof of concept projects. So for me, it's important still to see what really happens out there in real life and to really experience what's happened there. And especially CMMN as the topic from today is something which really emerged from reality, from some proof of concepts we did early 2014. So I think it's really valuable to have this feedback, even on the founder level. If you want to reach out to me, you can always send me an email. You have the email on the slides. You can find me on Twitter, and I'm pretty sure you will find me in the internet. It's actually not that hard to find me. And yeah, I've written basically a couple of books, but the most important one might be the Real Life BPMN book, which is available in German, English, and Spanish. And we get really good feedback for that. So that might be interesting to check out. That's for me. Yeah, today we want to have a look at CMMN, which is actually a pretty new standard. It was published in May last year. So it's really fresh and new, and it's about case management. CMMN stands for Case Management Model and Notation. That might be familiar if you know BPMN. It stands for Business Process Model and Notation. So you can see that these standards are really close together. And yeah, I have a quote here about case management, and that says it's about activities that are not so predefined and repeatable, like BPMN processes, but depends on evolving circumstances and ad hoc decisions by knowledge workers. And this is a pretty important thing we want to tackle today. So as soon as you need more flexibility than basically fixed BPMN processes, basically have a predefined order of activities and not much freedom within one process instance to do something different than you modeled in the BPMN file, then in CMMN wants to have more flexibility for, basically for the humans, for the people working in the process. So this is normally called the knowledge worker, which is kind of an expert for a specific situation. So he has experience, he has knowledge. If he looks at the context of a case, we will see that in the example later on, he can decide what would be a good thing to do. And he has the freedom to decide, maybe out of different options. Okay, so he can always decide what is the best in this particular situation. And this is different to what we know from BPMN, where we have a predefined order where we exactly define, okay, if this activity happens, then this activity will happen. Maybe we have gateways, decisions, but even they are really predefined. We will see that in the example later on, what the difference is. There are a couple of typical use cases actually for that. At least for us at the moment, the most important ones or most interesting ones are from the insurance industry. The example I have later on is from insurance. So you very often do application handling. So if you want to issue a new policy, or claim processing with case management, because there you still have a lot of humans involved deciding some stuff. Healthcare is a really good example. So if you, for example, if you go to the hospital, basically the path through the hospital is never predefined, because it's actually not known what will happen. So if you get a medical care, nobody knows if the treat will work or not, right? So that always depends on you. And then there are a lot of surprises you can have, and very important, the decisions have to be actually made by humans, the doctor, because he is responsible afterwards for what he decided. So it's not that easy for a machine to decide what treat should get or not. Or there are a lot of examples of exception handling. So there might be a normal flow which is really structured, but if you have any exceptional situation, then maybe a human has to resolve that problem, and this might be much more unstructured. So there, CMMN might be a good idea. This all will get much more concrete when we get to the example. Okay, so with all this in mind, CMMN was basically standardized. It's a specification from the OMG. The OMG did the BPMN as well. We have an specification version 1.0, and we already shipped an implementation. So we started pretty early with implementing CMMN, and we shipped the implementation with the recent version with the 7.2. So there you can already execute CMMN 1.0. We will have a look at the coverage later on, so what we can do and what we cannot do. Okay, that's CMMN. The example I want to use today is underwriting. So basically, if you want to have a new policy, new insurance policy, let's say this could be a life insurance, then we might have a process like this. This is actually, it's a real life process, but it's simplified to be able to show it here. So we did it more or less like this at a real customer project, but it's really simplified here. So if you want to have this new policy, you basically have an application. So this will be either received electronically via internet form or these kind of things, or still you send it on paper, then it will be scanned and somebody has to type it into the computer. Some customers might already scan some OCR software on it, but we really have a lot of customers still really scanning it, showing a picture in the user interface and somebody typing it from it, because it's maybe even cheaper, I don't know, but it's still done a lot out there. Then we validate that application, so it might be that this is duplicate, or if we have any other problems. We add some additional information from any third-party services, like whatever, some information on the address or some rating or whatever. So there are a couple of services we query for additional information. Then we have a rule task where basically couple of rules are fired in order to determine who can do the underwriting, because that depends on the policy type, on the basically on the maybe on the name of the applicant. So the clerk A only does applicants from A to C, maybe on the region you're living it, and some other stuff. Okay, so that's a rule table. And as soon as we have assigned that underwriter, he should do the actual underwriting of the policy, which basically means he decides if the policy is issued or not. And then it starts to get interesting, because for that decision, or when he basically starts to decide he actually has a look at the application, at the applicant, so at a lot of information which are part of the context here. And then he decides maybe he needs some more information from a doctor. So that might be for the health insurance. It might be okay. This is a certain age or a certain history of the guy. That's a bit strange. I might want to get some more information from his doctor. So I request that. I can model that in BPMN, right? So I can say, okay, cannot do the decision at the moment. I need more information. So then a process is started in order to send an email to the doctor. The doctor has to respond in some way, and then this is put in the process, and then I can decide. And during I'm doing that, it might be that I see, okay, that's still a bit strange. I want to phone the applicant in order to ask him a couple of questions. Okay, and this might be a separate user task because maybe I'm not doing that as an underwriter, but I can hand over that to some call center or what, or these things. And you can make up a lot of more examples what can happen during the decision, what you need to do additionally. And somewhere at the end, you really can decide if this is approved or not, and then it goes on. So you get the policy or it's rejected. In real life, by the way, there's still normally a third way here, which basically says, okay, we cannot do the policy exactly as you requested it, but if we do that change or just a small tiny change here, then we can give you the policy. So it might be that we even change the application and talk to the applicant, maybe resubmit it or whatever. I think you get the idea. So that was the BPMN process we did in a first phase of the project. And actually what happened is that, you have it bigger for the slide later on, is that this really doesn't work out in the underwriting phase very good because you need more flexibility because the ordering is not predefined and you might have more surprises. And the more tasks you get here, the more, or let's say then it gets really, really hard to model here because BPMN is not really meant for that flexibility. So you can do it. So there are a couple of, let's say, workarounds in order to do it. But the more you get, the harder it gets. Okay. There are other, that's important. Come back to that later on. There are other parts of the process which are still 100% structured, like the beginning or creating the policy and sending it via post to the applicant, or this is really structured. So their BPMN is perfect. It's working really, really well, but it doesn't work that good for this underwriting phase. So that's obviously something CMMN can help. So what I did basically on the next slide is a CMMN model, and I will briefly go through the elements of CMMN so that you get a better idea of what CMMN means. And I start with the basically the outer line here. That means it's a case. Okay, so it's basically the image of a folder. Because the idea is that the case is some kind of bracket around the context. So if you have that picture of a folder, like the human gets a folder with a lot of information in it, and this is basically the image the case management guys took in order to shape CMMN. So that's why you have a folder. You can have information attached to it, like for us they are case variables, or you could think of links to documents or whatever. That means you can really have information for that case available. Okay, so that's the case. Within the case, we have a couple of tasks or activities. The first one is the one with the small guy here in the corner, which is so-called human task. It's basically more or less the same than in BPMN. In BPMN, it's called user task. Here it's called human task, but it's really the same. So that means there is something to do for somebody, which boils down to, in our engine, to a task being created and really being pushed on the task list, like with BPMN. You have the same attributes you can configure on the human task than you have on a user task in BPMN. So that means, for example, you can control the assignment to which group or which people the human task is assigned, which form should be shown in order to work on it, and all these things. We will see that in the demo. Okay. So that's a user task. As you can see, there are a couple of attributes you can set on a task. So this small play symbol basically means that's auto-activated. Auto-activated means as soon as I start the case instance, this user task, this human task is directly activated. It's started. That basically means the task is put on the task list. That sounds somehow obvious that this task is started, but if you see it in contrast to, for example, the Taylor interview with the applicant, this doesn't have the play symbol, so this is manual activated. And that means if I start the case, this one goes to the task list, but these ones here not. These ones, basically, the human decides if he wants to do the Taylor interview or not. Okay, from the CMMN point of view, it's just enabled. It might be activated by the human, so it's enabled, it's available, but it's not really started. That one is started, it's directly activated. We will see that life cycle defined by the CMMN specification on some of the next slides. Okay, so then I hope that gets a bit more clear, but that's the auto-activate symbol here. We do not only have human tasks, we also have process tasks. The process task, background a process instance started. So normally we use BPMN here. So we can start a BPMN process, and as soon as the BPMN process completes, that activity here is completed as well. Okay, so we can have processes started as part of the case. I don't have it in this example, but we could have case tasks as well, so we can have a hierarchy of cases, so we can have sub-cases basically. Okay, so that works as well. What else do we have? We have milestones. I think that's pretty obvious what a milestone is. So at some point in the case, I might reach that milestone. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. The important thing here, and the more interesting one, are these small diamonds, which are called sentries. And sentries are basically kind of a guard, which controls if that milestone is reached or not. So in that sentry, you can add conditions. The first possible condition is what you can see. Oh, sorry, with that connector, for example. So this sentry, for example, has the one part of the guard is that this human task has to be finished, completed, in order to that for that milestone to be reached. And what we cannot see graphically, but what is added in the background as well, is a condition on some data. In this case, I just separated these two milestones because here it's checked if the application is approved. Then this sentry basically is true, and then this milestone is reached. Or if it's rejected, then this milestone is reached. Okay, I could have done one milestone which basically says the decision is made. That would be perfectly well here, but I just did it that way in order to be to have it easier explained. And it's basically up to you when you're modeling it. There's still a bit of freedom to decide what you do here. It's basically the same as with BPMN. Then I have these diamonds here. They are called exit criteria. So basically that is a result of the case. Okay, so I either have the underwriting approved or Okay, the milestones are normally not used to transport results to the outside of the case, but they can be used internally. So I might reach a milestone, and this milestone might trigger other tasks to be enabled or not to be available. Okay, so it might be that after you made the decision, maybe other tasks get available and some of them are not longer available. And this can be steered by milestones pretty easy. Okay. Good. We will see a more complex example of CMMN later on. Okay, so don't worry at the moment. And yeah, we can have sentries controlling user tasks. So here the example is that we do the tailor interview with the applicant. And if we have done that, if we have completed that, then we can do a review of the interview results. We cannot do that one if we don't do a tailor interview. Okay, this is basically what this sentry is doing. The important thing, very important thing is, in contrast to BPMN, this is not a sequence flow. It doesn't mean if I do that, the next thing I do is that one. It's really a condition that this is only possible if this one has completed. Okay, that's an important difference actually, and it's always a bit confusing at the beginning. So that's basically CMMN. There are a couple of more elements we will see a bit more later on, but we already tackled the most important actually. So it's not really rocket science and much less attributes than BPMN. Okay, that's our case. That's the CMMN. If we, now when we have that CMMN, the case for doing the underwriting, the actual underwriting, what we can do, we can make the BPMN process much easier, right? Because now we can really have the structured part, which is really without any flexibility needed. We can have that in BPMN, and we extract the part which is unstructured, which needs the flexibility into the case. Okay. From a BPMN point of view, it would be nice to have a simple call activity in order to do that. This is currently not possible in the BPMN standard. Not possible because basically BPMN is much older than CMMN. So when BPMN 2.0 was released, there was no CMMN yet. So that cannot be part of the standard. I think, or I hope it will be added in the next BPMN version, which is not yet clear when there will be a next BPMN version. So this is still a bit open. From a Camunda point of view, we will add an extension to make this possible in the next Camunda BPM version in 7.3, which ships in May 2015. So that's actually not far away. Okay. Then this will be possible in Camunda BPM. For the moment, what I did in the demo and what you can do if you already want to start a project with CMMN and BPMN combined is basically just to have a service task starting a case instance and then receive task waiting for the case instance to complete, and then you can in the case don't have a slide on that, but in the cases you can add listeners, so bit of pieces of Java code on different events like starting the case, starting a activity, completing an activity, completing the case. So you can easily add a listener there, which basically then triggers the receive task on the BPMN process waiting for it. It's actually not very hard to do at the moment, and we're adding the call activity then in 7.3, so it might be a good idea to start with that workaround and going productive with 7.3, and then you can already remove it. And right. There are other possibilities. Okay, you could, if you don't like the two tasks, you can have the receive task with the listener on the enter event and starting the case there. Or what you can do as well, you can hack the call activity behavior we have. You can exchange every behavior in the engine. and basically extend it in order to behave for a case instance. We have an example online doing that, but I actually would not recommend really going deep in the engine. I think there's not a big value in doing that, because it's just a matter of waiting for 7.3, and I guess there are not a lot of people going productive with CMMN with 7.2, because I think you need some time in order to do the projects, right? Okay. Maybe a short hint when I'm talking about timelines. For us, it's really interesting what you're doing with the CMMN. So it would be really cool to get feedback from you guys via the forum, via the support if you're enterprise customer, sending me an email or whatever channel you prefer. But give us feedback what you're doing with case management, what you think about CMMN. Are we lacking features you might want to have, and these kind of things? Okay, we're really interested in that feedback, because for us, case management is really a hot topic at the moment. We looked a lot at case management in the last year. That's why we are implementing CMMN so fast. And now we're really looking at the real life project in order to see what we can do in the product in order to make your life easier. And the feedback really helps. Okay. So the other way around, that's pretty easy. You can see that in the example later on. So if you have a case, you can have a process task, and then you can directly start a BPMN process. And if that finished, that task get completed. Okay, there you don't need any workaround. That works out of the box, and it's part of the standard. Yeah. One thing I experienced when discussing about CMMN, which I actually did a lot in the last year, is that it really helps if you look at it from a user interface perspective. So if you look at the UI, in order to understand how CMMN thinks. So a typical UI more or less looks like that. This is a UI we will see in a couple of minutes in the demo. Okay, this is something I built as a demo UI. In this case, it's JSF from the technology, but you could build that in any technology. And maybe the concrete layout might be different if you build it or if you have it in real life, but the building blocks are normally always the same from what I saw over the products I know about case management. So you always have these case contexts. So in my case, it's just I have basically which customer doing an application. Might be much more in a real life case, right? So you might access some information about the customer or the application or the policy, or you might even have like links, or you might expand that section. You might have documents uploaded, and really the whole context for the case in order to give the knowledge worker the possibility to do an informed decision. Okay, so that's the case context. The second building block we have is the activities of that case. So if we look back to the CMMN, there are a couple of activities we modeled. They might be active. So this is the wording from the specification, and in the brackets I added the wording which I think is intuitive for most of us. But that one is from the specification, so that's important as well. So they are active activities. That means they are currently running. So as soon as I start my case instance, I mentioned this earlier, the decide on application user task was auto activate, so it's immediately activated. Okay, so this is running. There's a task open in the task management. There are other activities which you now might want to activate. So they are basically available for the human, okay, but it's your decision if you want to activate them or not. In CMMN, that's named enabled activity. Okay, enabled activities can be activated. Well, that's the doctor information request or the tailor interview. When I already finished or completed activity, it's it's basically completed. Then it's in like in BPMN, it's in the history, so I can show everything which is already completed. By the way, just a remark. So the comment from co-underwriter is completed, so it's not enabled anymore. You can, CMMN has some attributes in order to do something repeatedly. So you could do something like, I can do that multiple times. Okay, I haven't done that here. And I basically have, the task form. So if I work on a task, I have a form, right, in the context of a case. So if I'm in the task of deciding, I still can see all the context. I can decide, okay, perfect, but I want to do the doctor information request now. So I can do that, okay, and I don't have to finish the task immediately. So that's basically the layout of the user interface here. We will see that in action in a minute. Okay. That's what I mentioned earlier. There is the life cycle of a task defined by the CMMN specification. And this is important to understand. If you want to work with the CMMN, you should understand that life cycle. So as soon as you have a task, like a human task, for example, in your CMMN model, it gets available, right? It might get enabled if it's possible to start that, if it's possible to do. So, for example, wait a second, the review interview results will not be enabled because that entry basically says it's not possible at the moment because that one is not yet completed. Okay, so this is not enabled. These are enabled because they are possible, and this one is directly started, so it's active. Okay, when you complete it afterwards, it's completed. And the other ones are not that interesting for the moment, like suspended or disabled or terminated. Okay, so this is the important life cycle for the moment. So this life cycle, basically, you can find that in the UI. So we have the enabled ones for the human to decide to start. We have the activated ones which are currently running, and we have the completed ones. And the available ones are not shown because you cannot do anything about it. Okay, good. If you understand that, it's already 90% you need to know for the CMMN. Right, and I always try to be quick in order to get to the demo because I think that makes life much easier. It makes things much easier to understand. So what do I have here? I basically have the BPMN process I already had on the slide, right? So I create the case instance and I wait for completion. I have a process application developed here. It's typical Camunda process application. It's a Maven project. I added the BPMN file. I added the case file. That's interesting. And I added the JSF backend and the JSF frontend, basically. Okay. So there are no big surprises here. The whole code is available. Here's the link. Okay. But you will find it if you Google for it. So in our Camunda consulting repository, you have that code. So you can later on, you can go through all the details you wanna check out because I only show a couple of highlights today because of the time. So where do we start? Okay, maybe we start with the CMMN file. So what I do have here is the underwriting case CMMN file. You see it .cmmn, which is basically an XML. The maybe interesting remark on the tool chain. We started, which is basically the I would say the typical German engineering approach we normally do. We started with the engine, with the execution. So we implement the CMMN engine, which basically can execute case instances. We haven't yet built a modeler, so we don't have a graphical modeler for CMMN at this moment. And we haven't yet built everything into Cockpit, into the monitoring. We'll show you that later, what you can do at the moment. This will be next steps. Okay, so we started with the engine because that's core. We need to have that in order to do anything in the project. And now we will see how that gets adopted, and then we might build a modeler later on. I'm actually pretty sure we do, but it's not yet on a concrete timeline. What's pretty likely actually that will happen is that we, you might know that we have the BPMN IO project, which is a BPMN modeler, completely JavaScript based, browser based. And we build BPMN IO in a way that the basic modeler is really generic, so we can easily build like a CMMN modeler on top of that. So as I said, it's not a fixed timeline, but I expect some CMMN modeler on top of BPMN IO somewhere in the future in order to really graphically model CMMN. For the moment, I have a slide on that. I use the Trisotech CMMN web modeler, it's called, which working tool as well. I think it's the only CMMN modeler you have there out in the market at the moment. There you can have the BPMN file. You can export CMMN XML, which I basically used then in Eclipse, and added a couple of attributes I needed for the execution. Okay, so that is my current tool chain here. Then I have that CMMN file. We have a deeper look at that in a couple of minutes because we want to change something in there. Okay, but as soon as I add it to my process application, what I can do, I can now deploy it on my engine. So in the background, I have, in this case, I have a JBoss application server running with the 21EE. You can use the 7.2.0 community edition as well. But you have to use a real application server because I use JSF in the demo. Okay, so Tomcat doesn't work for JSF. And I only tested that on JBoss application server, so I would recommend to use that. It should work on Wildfly as well, but I haven't tested it. Okay, so I have an empty engine here. Let's quickly check that. Well, so there's nothing deployed here. Now, as soon as I deploy this application, we can check that in our JBoss. I basically built the VOR, copy it to my JBoss, so it gets picked up, and you can see it picks up some BPMN files, and it picks up some case definitions, so the underwriting.cmmn. So it basically works like a BPMN file, so it automatically gets discovered, gets deployed to the engine. So if I go back to Cockpit, I can now see my BPMN processes, and I see my deployed cases. One important remark here, I mentioned earlier that we have not yet support for CMMN in Cockpit. But what is out there is a plugin. So you might know that Cockpit is able to integrate plugins. So you can write plugins in order to extend the functionality of Cockpit. We have the plugin store, which basically is a list of plugins, right? So there are a couple of really nice ones, but anyway. And there's a plugin for case management, which I used here in order to see the case definitions and the case instances. Okay, so this plugin is a recommendation for you as well to use that when you get started with the case management. So I can see there's my underwriting case, and I don't have any case instance yet, which basically makes sense. Okay, this is, and what I have as soon as I deployed, I have my my JSF user interface ready, so I can log in. And now we'll basically play through one case, so I can have a new case new application. So I wanna have some health insurance. I have whatever. Oh, my name is Bernd. Create that application. And now the interesting thing is, and a user interface for case management is actually a really hot topic. So you can discuss a lot about that, and we did that a lot in the past. there are two ways you can now basically access a case. So the first is you're still thinking in task lists. That might be true for a lot of examples out there. So it might be that some guy is now triggered that he should decide on an application. So he gets that in his inbox, maybe get an email notification and knows, okay, I should work on that application. By the way, you can still use our task list. So it's a normal user task. Okay. The second possibility you have in order to get to a case is really an overview about the case. So it might be that I want to have a look at this customer or this application. He might call me or whatever. So you can also access the case via some kind of search and go in the case and see basically the whole context and see what happens in the case. And then you might navigate into the tasks which are currently available or active. Okay. But for the moment, I want to use the task list. I basically see I have to decide on that application. I open the form. What I basically did, I used the external form in order to jump to the JSF page, in order to have the case context and to have the JSF task form embedded in that frame. Okay, so I see what I have to do. I see some data. I can enter some stuff. I have to decide if I approve or not. But I can also see all the CMMN activities. So what I can do, for example, I can say, okay, this is interesting, but I need the doctor information request. So please start that process. So now this is running, no longer enabled. And if I go to cockpit, now I can see a couple of things. I see that doctor information request running. I maybe should do that task actually in order to walk through the process, because you can see I can have a nice little workaround for the demo if for 1 minute it's ended. So I maybe complete that before I explain you more of it. So I have this process instance running. I have the overall process running, which basically now waits for the case instance completion. If I look at that, you can see that I stored the case instance ID within the process instance in order to connect them to. And maybe one interesting hint, we have a webinar on next week on data and connectors and templates and these kind of things. What you can see here, we can now easily store Java objects serialized as JSON or XML in the process engine, which is actually pretty cool. We did a lot of things there, but that's topic for next week. Okay, so we have that one, and obviously we have our case instance running, where you can basically see what we see as the user interface as well. So we have a couple of running activities. So the whole case, the two human tasks, we have a couple of enabled ones, and so on and so on. Okay. I go back to my case. Wait a second. That's actually not that nice. I have to improve the JSF UI. If I go back to the case, in the meanwhile, my process is ended. That's pretty cool. And let's say I want to do the tele interview. I start that. Important thing here, I could still use the assignment, so that tele interview might not be done by me, but it's now assigned to somebody else who has it on its task list. And even if I can click on that now here, if you build a real application and this is not a task assigned to your group, you can easily build it in a way that you cannot access it. You can see it. That's always important to have the context, but you cannot do it. Okay. But for the sake of simplicity, for that example, I can just click on the user task. I haven't implemented a reuser task here, but I can complete it. Okay, so now the tele interview is done. I called him, and what you can see now, the review is directly activated, which actually means, if you're really thinking about it, I have a small error in my screenshot here, because that means that the review interview result user task has that play symbol as well, because it's not only enabled, it's directly activated. Okay. So I might want to do that as well. So I see that in completed, and I don't do the comment go underwriter. So I decide here, I approve that. Do I approve that? Yes. Yes. Burn is fine. That's fine. And I approve. I approve. I complete that. And if I go back to my process instance, where is it? Underwriting. I go to the history and I see there's one process instance ended in the approved path. So if I look at that, I can see that was the one for me, right? And it was approved. So what I basically did, I handed over the approval into the process instance, so I can decide here. Okay. Yeah. What I haven't shown actually, but works well. So if there are still active activities, could not complete the case. Okay. So that's checked by the life cycle as well. Okay. So this is basically it. Maybe one thing I can quickly show you because that's interesting as well. So you basically saw how CMMN works in real life. We will change the CMMN file in a minute, so you get an impression there as well. What I quickly wanted to show you is a test case for all the Java people out there, just to give you an impression of the API. But it basically works like BPMN works in our engine. So we have a case service. We can say create a new case instance. This has a key. And then, for example, I can, in the case service, I can recall case execution. And case executions are maybe not completely intuitive at the beginning, but we basically aligned that with what we did in BPMN. There are executions as well, so we called that case execution. And it basically means for every activity here, we create an execution in the background, and this execution now knows about the life cycle of that activity. So, for example, for that case execution, I can now ask if this case execution is enabled. Okay, so maybe to remind you of the life cycle, by the way, there's a CMMN reference online, which is actually really good. So even if you're not using the Camunda engine for execution, if you just want to learn about CMMN, that reference is really recommendable. But actually you don't have any other. So it's maybe pretty likely that you execute on Camunda. Because it explains the life cycles by a couple of examples, and you have all the images here, so you can see which life cycles you have. Okay. Yeah, and then you can set variables and so on, right? Yeah, I can close it. We don't go into any details of the API at the moment. The only thing I wanted to show you is that basically how the API works. Pretty comparable to what we do in processes. Yeah, there's something interesting to have a look in here. I don't think so. If you look through the example, I hope it's pretty obvious. For example, in the case controller, which is the JSF backend to that user interface, you have, for example, something like case instance status, load case instance status, where we do exactly that. From the process engine over the case service, get all the case executions for that case instance. Okay. Then we go through them, check if they are active, then we remember them in this list. If they are, enabled, we remember it in that list. And then we go to the history service and get all the historic case activity instances, the one which are already completed. Remember it in this list. And these three lists are basically the ones which are used in order to fill these data here. Okay. Good. Yeah, and so on and so forth. I mean, It's JSF and it's Java. It should not be that hard to get. One thing I want to do now that I do something live is I want to change the CMMN, the case definition. So I want to add, if you're getting some life insurance or health insurance, is working for both examples. At least in Germany, it makes a difference if you're a smoker or not. So you have to add that in your application. And if you're a smoker, that's risky for the insurance company. So they might not insure you, but which is, I think, more common is that you have to pay a surcharge or get more expensive. But that's something the knowledge worker should be able to decide. But he only has to decide that if you're a smoker, right? If you're not a smoker, we don't have to bother the knowledge worker with that task. And that's something we now want to add. So if we go to the case definition, we want to add the human task. So the first thing, and I'm just using copy and paste, so no need for a graphical modeler at this moment. So it's actually pretty easy to add. So I add the human task, smoker, and I say adjust risk profile for smoker. I say is blocking is true. It's basically an attribute, which means if I say is blocking is false, that means that the engine doesn't wait for the task. It doesn't make a lot of sense in executable cases. It's a bit like manual tasks in BPMN, if you know them, but it's not very important at the moment. And then I have a couple of attributes we use in BPMN as well. So, for example, I assign that always to the demo user, which doesn't make sense in reality, but a lot of sense for my demo. And I assign a form, always the same JSF form, which feeds and these kind of things. So I have my human task ready. The next thing I need, and that's important to know, the human task is now only the definition of the human task, but it's not yet used in the case definition. You always need that so-called plan item in order to really use it in your case. The idea behind is that you can reuse that human task definition in different parts of the case. Yeah, it's like that in the specification. So we have the human task smoker. So that's a reference to the human task we just created. And I want to have a sentry. So we want to have a guard, because that one should be only available if we are a smoker, right? So I add that sentry as well. So the sentry smoker. A sentry can have different parts. The so-called on part would be the check if another plan item is already completed in that case. So that basically is exactly that line. Something we don't need here. And we have an if part where we can add a condition. So we can add expression language, like in BPMN. And this one is the one we want to use at the moment. So we have our application as case variable, and there we want to have an attribute smoker. So if we have the smoker, this one now gets enabled. Okay. So that's everything I need to change here. Now I still have to change my application because I don't have the smoker there yet. So that should be smoker that way. And we have to add it to our user interface. So that's the JSF page when I create a new application. There I want to have the smoker added. Smoker, that smoker, and we have to make it a checkbox, which I remember how they call FH checkbox. Yeah, this one. So we have the checkbox. This one we don't need. And we bind it to the smoker. Yeah, that's it. Actually, that should be sufficient. So I redeploy that one. What happens here as well, like in BPMN, we get a new a version of the case. Okay, so case definitions are versions like processes. And now I can get back to my application, which is redeployed. Now I have the smoker, so I say there is now John Doe, he is a smoker. And if I create now the case and go into the task, what you can see is that I now get that task enabled, adjust risk profile for smoker. Whereas maybe just to make the check, double check it, if I don't select the smoker and I create that one, I don't have that task available. Okay, pretty straightforward here. So that's something I wanted to change here. So yeah, pretty good, right? I hope that got some impression how CMMN works, how that works in the engine, and how that's implemented in Camunda. So I will switch back to the slides. CMMN might be more complex. So as shown you till now, you could like oh, this is, but it's basically just like a bit more powerful sub-process. So that could be like a vendor extension. You could hack into BPMN, and this is maybe not necessary to have something like CMMN. But the interesting part is that CMMN gets much more powerful, so you can do much more things with it. And you might even have cases without a BPMN file around it. And this is an example where I extended the process I already have. Like one thing we have there as well are so-called stages. So a stage is a kind of a phase in my case. So it might be that I have the preparation phase. So somebody prepares the decision, okay, and he might to gather all these additional information. And then the result might be that he rejects the application, so that's directly rejected, or he advises for an approval. And that starts a new phase, which is the real underwriting phase, where somebody has to really approve it, which might be somebody like the boss. And then it might even be, again, like a user task dependent on some entry, which takes into account the application. So that might even incorporate like a rule base again, which checks if this policy is some kind of risky. So if that's the case, this task gets enabled, so he can easily start that task, and he easily sees that this is a risky policy. Okay, so the whole idea is that with the CMMN file, you still model in advance the possibilities that people have later on, and have to model the sentries, and you might add a lot of conditions and maybe some rules in order to get that running, to support the knowledge worker to do the work easier, to really to make informed decisions and to make that. That's the idea of CMMN. Okay. I have a slide on that later on. That's in contrast to what we call adaptive case management, which is much more flexible. But this is what we call dynamic case management. So during runtime, you still have a lot of flexibility, but you predefine the options in the CMMN file. Okay. Yeah, and you have the exit criteria. Already mentioned that earlier. If you look at the 7.2 release, I already mentioned that we have a coverage map online. So if you wanna check what we already implemented and what we did not implement, just check the coverage map like with BPMN. But we actually did already a pretty good job there. So, and what I mentioned earlier, if you're missing something important for your project, let us know, right? On our roadmap, not yet with a concrete timeline, but on our roadmap is that we do the discretionary task, and we do a couple of the markers like the required repetition or the autocomplete. The autocomplete is almost there. There just was a small bug, to be honest, so it's not usable in the 7.2.0. It's pretty likely that it's usable in the 7.2.3 2 enterprise, or in the next alphas of the 7.3 and then 7.3. And yeah, this is it. And you see it's not that much in CMMN like in BPMN. For the case file items, so for the data, we will not implement what the standard is doing like in BPMN, because we use our process variables or case variable mechanism. So we have this map where we can store everything during runtime what you want. Okay. Yeah. If you're interested in what's in the coverage or not. For the tool chain, that's something I mentioned earlier. So we don't have our own modeler yet. So what you can do, either you do it completely in plain XML. It's actually possible. It's not that uncommon to do. That's what's shown in the Getting Started guide. So which is really recommendable actually, if you want to do your first CMMN application, I would recommend to do that Getting Started tutorial, because it walks you through step by step, and then you have the case, and you basically add the stuff step by step in the XML, which is not that hard to do. But if you want to have the picture, what I would recommend is to give the Trizotech CMMN web modeler a try, or you still might want to use Visio or like, but Visio cannot export CMMN. Trizotech can export CMMN as an XML. It can export PNG, and these two I used in my Eclipse project. Added the attributes I needed, deployed it on our normal environment, like with my war into my JBoss, and then I built my own JSF user application, user interface, which is actually pretty common as well. So so far I still expect a lot of specific user interfaces to appear in projects around case management. So I think it will be really hard to build a generic case management user interface. Not yet sure if we will do that or if we try to tackle that. For the moment, we basically look at all the projects we see and check if there's a generic baseline. And this might get part of our task list later on or not yet decided. But for the moment, it's pretty likely that you build your own user interface with the context and these activities there. And then depending on the technology, either use the Java or the REST API. And what I can recommend is the Cockpit plugin. Then you can already see something, even if it's not part of the Cockpit as shipped with the product. That's actually a good example for plugins, because the whole ACM plugin, so the case management plugin, was done by a partner of us. So it's basically community work, it's community effort. Especially these Simon did that on, I think, a couple of weekends. And I think that's really a great example, first of all, for how easily you can extend Cockpit if you're missing features. Right? So he was not complaining about, hey, there must be case management in Cockpit. He basically just built a plugin in order to get that. So it's pretty cool. You see that the community is really doing stuff, which I really appreciate. And it's always a good start in order to get it in the product. So what we can do now with the plugin is play around with the requirements are basically met by the plugin, and that maybe helps build that later on in Cockpit itself. Important information, maybe the plugins are community extensions, so they are not part of the core product. They are not supported as part of the enterprise edition. So you don't have the SLA-based support and could call us 24 hours if there are any bugs in that plugin, right? Okay. Good. So this is recommended if you want to play around with CMMN. I already mentioned that. Again, the hint, there is not yet a fixed roadmap. So there are not any dates I can already tell you. It's basically intended because what we normally do is if we do something completely new like CMMN, What we now want to see in the real life product is how it's used and what the people are missing and what really is the most important feature we have to build first, so we can really go in there in a prioritized way and build the right features the right way and not thinking or basically, making up features we think somebody can use. So now we enter a phase where we really want you doing stuff with it. And that's why I motivated earlier to send us the feedback. So that's really important for us and important to settle the roadmap. But some things I already have on my mind, which will happen sooner or later, are obviously to extending the coverage, so the required attributes, discretionary, the events, and these kind of things. We obviously have to add it to Cockpit, right? So really, as part of the core product, you have to be able to see something. And what I mentioned earlier, I expect that we build a CMMN modeler on as a web-based modeler on BPMN IO basis sooner or later. It's more or less a matter of time. And if you have anything which is important to you, just let us know. So that was basically the overview of CMMN. It was the overview of case management in Camunda BPM 7.2. So I hope that already gave a good impression on what we can do there. And what I want to do quickly as a ramp up is, just look a bit on structured and unstructured work and basically on when to use CMMN and BPMN, because for me it's really important that you get an understanding on what problem we can see it in a lot of projects. So go back to the beginning, if you remember that BPMN, so basically have structured and these unstructured work where we needed more flexibility. Okay, so obviously BPMN is a good tool for the structured work, and CMMN is a good tool for the unstructured work. And we already saw a couple of I called it patterns. It's not a complete list, or it's not really a pattern in the academic pattern way, but I saw that in a couple of projects already. So I thought it's worth to write it on a slide. So I already saw that pattern we had here a couple of times, that we have a structured phase where it's done all the preparation, like the input handling, the scanning, the validating, the storing in some system, loading additional data, and all these kind of things. So doing a lot of preparations. And when you have all the data together, then a decision is made by maybe some expert, by a human. And if that is done, then the whole processing or provisioning or whatever, billing or these kind of things are done in a really structured way. Again, you can see that in healthcare as well. So a lot of the preparation is done really structured, but then the examination or what the doctor does is basically really unstructured. And afterwards, all the documentation or the billing and these kind of things are again really structured. Another pattern is that you try to do it really in a structured way, and if there is some exception, then you handle that manually, because it often doesn't make sense to model all the exceptional cases, which then doesn't happen very often. Then you have one or experts or administrators really handling that and maybe correcting the data and throwing it back to the automated process, or maybe handling it completely manually or whatever. Okay, so these are typical patterns. There are cases where you really have completely non-routine work. The example I always stress is that, for example, we do our own conference once a year, the so-called BPMCon. There we have a marketing girl basically organizing that. Okay, and we obviously do not automate that work. It's not really structured because that's once a year, and we have Nastasia really knowing what she is doing there, and so she basically do it, right? There's no sense in really structuring that. There is at the moment actually no value in really doing a CMMN model for that as well, but you could imagine that if we're doing more and more events, it might be at least helpful to have a CMMN model for the repetitive tasks within that event handling, like booking the room or sending the email to the attendees. Or there are a couple of things which are always the same, and it might be helpful. We are not doing that at the moment, but it might be helpful, but it will never be a completely automated BPMN process, right? There are cases which are then not even meant for CMMN, like that's what I meant. And there's something called adaptive case management. And to be honest, we often use the marketing term ACM or adaptive case management for what we do with the case management as well, because it's the marketing term well known out there. And a lot of people don't know what the adaptive is really for. And adaptive basically means that the system really adapts on the needs, and maybe it's even self-learning. That would be perfect adaptive system. So for example, if Nastasia is organizing the events and sending a lot of emails to people for asking for the room prices or the food or whatever, the system could expect all the emails and learn from that some of the emails for the next year it can send automatically. That would be really an adaptive system. And we're not yet there. I mean, there are a lot of interesting things going on about real adaptive case management, but it's not really out there in the real projects yet. So what we do with CMMN is dynamic case management, because we have flexibility but predefined activities, so we can dynamically react within the process. That's still a big difference, and it's important to know in the back of your mind. But yeah, as said it earlier, we are naming it ACM because otherwise you're out of the Google searches, which is not nice to be. And there's a pretty interesting topic like process mining, still around the corner. It's for most of the projects. It's still a bit complicated and a bit expensive, the tools, but it's interesting to have a look. So for example, if you start with CMMN doing all the cases, what process mining can do is extract from the audit logs some information on how your processes run, or maybe if you're not using CMMN, if you use any other system, you still can extract processes from it, and then you can see if the process is structured or not. So maybe you see later on as a surprise that the process is really structured. Could be an interesting topic, but it's for the future. For me, very important is that you basically differentiate between the automated routine work and the non-routine work. And what we see very often is that this is done in the wrong way. So it might be with the example from our conference that you really have knowledge workers which are really empowered to decide, which decide on a case-by-case basis. So this it's really intended that the human makes the decision. What we see very often out there is that basically companies lack basically the discipline in order to get BPMN implemented, because it's a lot of change for the company. So it might be that you have a process which should be really structured and maybe even automated, but you cannot easily get there because you have to change a lot in workflow for the people in order to get there. And that's the thing to do. Okay, that takes a lot of time, but the important thing is that you still recognize, okay, but it's a structured problem. I just need a way to get to that structured way of doing it. Versus you really have a problem which is unstructured by default, where you want to have the knowledge worker, where you want to have flexibility because it's important for you. And these are different use cases you should keep in mind. You should not mix that up. For me, it's fine if you start with CMMN in an environment where you cannot quickly implement BPMN because of the change. But you should be aware that it's a structured problem. Okay, so that's a difference which is important to keep in mind. So it might be just or it might be a matter of maturity, right? Even if you're now having for example, the end-to-end process completely unstructured, and maybe you're using some software here, some use case, and maybe a small workflow tool there. So parts of it are automated. Then you might want to end up in a couple of years in a basically automated or at least structured end-to-end process with a couple of maybe remaining manual works where you cannot really structure it. Maybe you can even get rid of that. That's actually happening for a lot of processes. And even if ACM guys out there make the impression that all of the processes now, BPMN is really evil and it forces the people in some structured process flow, which is horrible for the people to work in. Actually, what's happening to the most of the processes out there, they are getting fully automated. Right? Because why is it though? Because this really scales. If you have a business process or you have your own company and you have a process model which is really structured, which is maybe even automated, that really scales. You can scale that up even maybe internationally easily. So one example we always use for showing that is Zalando. Not sure if Zalando is not yet there in every country all over the world, but they're basically expanding to more and more countries. It's a German startup, but they're basically all over Europe already, and they're expanding to other countries now. They're shipping clothing. So it's basically the German, let's say, Amazon for clothes. They're started only with shoes. Like 6 years ago. So you see that's pretty new company. And they started with 2 people in the cellar, basically, shipping shoes out of the cellar. And now they are already around 7,000 employees doing 1.8 billion euros revenue every year. So that's already grown to a huge company, and they are still growing by a huge number. And this cannot be done by unstructured processes by CMMN. This is done by really automating all the processes in BPMN and scale it up really on leveraging that. So for me, it's really important to distinguish that. Okay, and Zalando is always a good example for us because every Zalando order runs over the Camunda BPM engine, which always is a good proof that we're really scaling up as well on the process engine level. So we are already like to talk about Zalando because that's from the process instances per day. It's our I'm not sure if it's still the biggest. Like we have a second really huge one, but whatever. It's a huge one. Cannot tell. Okay, but what I mentioned earlier, it's okay if you cannot get there to the structured processes in one step. You might want to start with CMMN, or what we did in the past a couple of times actually already. So I made that on the slide as an example. That's from a real life project where we said, okay, we started. We have that very often as document, incoming document. Okay, so maybe there's an incoming document which should be processed. That's a completely generic user task. This guy has to decide what he does. So that would be a perfect CMMN file. I did that in a time where we did not yet have CMMN. Then I basically built up something like CMMN where I said I can have subtasks started whenever I'm there, which then are completely generic. Okay, so I can hand over the name, which would be so that's the headline in the task list later on. Then that's really, really cool. I can have this starting itself again. So you can really have recursion in BPMN, and then you can have completely generic task management. Okay. And I want to show this because what we do in these kind of projects is that when you start with something like that, you can already roll out the Camunda BPM platform. You can already roll out the tooling like a task list, and still the people don't have to change a lot. They they use the task list now, but you can normally sell that to the people because they have features like they now have deadlines, they have a reminder, they have follow-ups and these kind of things. So they have a couple of new features which might be cool for them. So they are willing to change from their email inbox to their task list. And then you might be what we normally do and what I different way select the main process. Like insurance is very often addressed changes because they are very occurring very often and they are pretty boring to do. Then you can start to model a process there. It will not be a CMMN. It might, or it's pretty likely to have a BPMN for that. In order to have that in a structured way, and then you basically build a gateway there, and you start to have structured processes, introducing them step by step. And this you can do very easy with the CMMN as well. In the beginning, you start very generic, and then you're getting more and more structured where structure is needed, and maybe when your maturity of the company improves. That's a pretty cool way actually of doing that. So maybe as a summary, for me it's important. I hope you got an impression of what CMMN can do, and I didn't talk about BPMN, so I expect you to know a bit of BPMN, so you know what BPMN can do. And this makes it now a bit easier to select the right tool for the job. From a Camunda BPM perspective, for us it's important they really can work together in a perfect way. So yeah, what I said, we add the call activity here, so we can start cases from a BPMN process, we can start processes from a case, we can mix them in a way that is optimal for your project. Okay, that's the idea behind it. Basically, that's what you still have like 10 minutes for the questions you had during the webinar. If you have any additional questions, now would be a good time to enter them in the chat window. What I wanna do in the meanwhile is I want to do a quick poll actually, because I'm always interested in what you guys are thinking. So there's a first poll, why you're actually here. That's always I'm really curious about. So did you already know CMMN or why you're here? That's a really good one. So please do the vote. That would be nice. And in the meanwhile, I will have a look at the questions. We will see what we can answer there. So there's a question about the standard BPMN versus CMMN. So why these are two standards and what the future will be. And that's actually a pretty good question. And it's actually at the moment it's hard to tell. So from a political point of view, it was, I think, a good decision to do CMMN as a separate standard, because standards are always political things, and it's hard to coin a standard. It's always a lot of work, a lot of discussion, a lot of people to involve. So it was much quicker to have a CMMN 1.0 separate standard. In the long term, I think it would be interesting to have BPMN and CMMN basically getting together in one standard. So it might be that when 3, for example, consume CMMN and then it's one standard. I'm not yet sure if that will happen, but it would be nice if it happens actually. From a Camunda BPM point of view, it's actually not a big difference. I mean, the engine is capable of both. Then if there will be a BPMN 3, we will implement the changes and then we're happy to go. So for the moment, but I think that will take time. So for the moment, what we are pushing actively is to improve some things on CMMN 1.0. We already know we want to have improved, so we hope to get to a CMMN 1.1 quickly, but let's see how long that will take. We have a couple of more questions, but I have a second poll I want to do actually before you leave. I actually want to have some feedback on the webinar as well. So there's another poll you can do in the meanwhile, and I go to the next question. Okay, I think that was already answered. There's a question from Ed, and I think that's already answered, right? If not, just repost it, please. Yeah, okay. First one. Is there a second question I didn't see? Yeah, there was a question, if I have repeating activities. That's the second question, right? The first, right. So the question is, if I have repeating activities, can I have them active simultaneously? And that's actually a good question, which I'm not completely sure of. So I would have to check the specification as well. The important news I can share at that moment is that if you had a quick eye on the coverage map earlier, you might have seen that we are not supporting the repeating activities yet. That's why I actually have no idea what the presentation says about it, because I'm always diving into the stuff we are already implementing. But make me a note that you're actually waiting for the repeating activities. It would be actually interesting if you maybe drop me a mail later on what your current use case is for that, because that was interesting. So I actually don't know what the specification is saying about that. So I'm sorry I cannot quickly answer that. So you can either check the specification yourself. So it's available online, and it's 90 or 100 pages or something like that. So it's not that huge. So it's easy to find stuff. Or you can ask in the forum. That's possible as well. Yeah. There's one last question I see here, which is about the relevance of CMMN. If we think that CMMN gets as relevant as BPMN, and that's actually a pretty tough question, which I don't know yet. So CMMN, from the concepts, from the execution semantics defined in the specs, is actually pretty interesting from my point of view for having the dynamic case management, especially for the engine like Camunda. So I like CMMN as a specification, and for us it's always interesting to be standards-based. On the other hand, I'm not yet sure about the value of the graphical diagrams. I don't have enough experience yet discussing that with business or end users, right? So we had a couple of projects, but not enough to really be convinced that this is working or not. So I keep a close eye on the graphical representation, and I still think that the use case for BPMN is bigger. Because what I said earlier, the automated processes and scaling business by automating processes, it's a much bigger use case, and it's much easier to calculate ROE and these kind of things for these projects than for case management, I think. But case management is more hype now, I think, because we understood BPMN, right? So we can do workflow in a really good manner now. So we can tackle the next problem. So I think that's why it's hype now. But the bigger value is still in BPMN. But I think it's a good addition, and let's see what the future will bring. So at least there's no other standard which is in competition. Okay. I don't see any additional question, which is great because we only have 1 minute left, so we are pretty good in time. I hope that was interesting for you guys. I hope it was not too long. 1.5 hours is always a bit challenging. I hope my English was okay for everybody, so you understood anything. And yeah, I always wait a second just to share the last slide. Where is it? Yeah, if you want to try it yourself, just do it. So I have the link to the code on Camunda.org. You can download the DevOps distribution, which works that CMMN is included. If you go to Camunda.org, you can download a trial for the Enterprise Edition as well. I don't go into the details of enterprise now. If you have any questions, basically, yeah, send us an email. There's a landing page where you can send us information, or you can call us if you like. And yeah, have fun with that. Thank you for your interest, and have a nice Friday evening and weekend. See you next time and maybe next week. Bye, guys.